The rain had turned the training field at Naval Base Coronado into a mess of thick, gray mud. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the obstacle course, watching the new recruits struggle through their drills. She wore plain workout clothes with no rank insignia, no medals, nothing to indicate who she was or what she'd done. That was exactly how she wanted it. At 42 years old, Sarah had spent the last 20 years in special operations. She'd been one of the first women to make it through SEAL training, back when the program had just opened to female candidates. She'd served in places whose names still couldn't be spoken aloud. She'd saved lives, lost friends, and carried scars, both visible and hidden. But 6 months ago, everything changed. A mission had gone wrong in ways that still made her wake up at night. Sarah had made a split-second decision that saved her team but cost her physically. The injury to her leg had been severe. The doctors said she'd never pass the physical requirements again. After 2 decades of service, Sarah was transferred to a training position. She was told to be grateful she still had a job in the Navy at all. The problem was that nobody at Coronado knew who she was. Her records were classified. Her achievements were sealed behind security clearances. To everyone on this base, she was just another desk officer who'd been given a token position working with the training program. And in a place that worshipped physical strength and combat readiness, that made her a target. "Hey, lady, you lost?" a voice called out behind her. Sarah turned to see 3 men approaching. They wore the cocky expressions of mid-level instructors who thought they owned the place. She recognized the leader, Chief Petty Officer Derek Marshall. He had a reputation for being tough on recruits, and even tougher on anyone he considered weak. "Just observing the training," Sarah said calmly. "I'm starting as an advisor next week." Marshall laughed, and his 2 companions joined in. "An advisor? What are you going to advise them on? How to file paperwork?" Sarah kept her expression neutral. She'd dealt with men like this her entire career. "I have some experience that might be useful." "Experience?" Marshall stepped closer, looking her up and down with obvious disdain. "Let me guess. You pushed papers at some office in San Diego, and now they're giving you a participation trophy by letting you hang around real warriors?" The other 2 men snickered. Sarah noticed several recruits had stopped their exercises to watch the confrontation. She could see the uncertainty in their young faces. Some looked uncomfortable with how Marshall was treating her. Others seemed to think it was funny. "I'm not here to cause problems," Sarah said quietly. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job?" Marshall's voice dripped with mockery. "Your job is to stay out of our way. We don't need some civilian contract worker or washed-up desk jockey telling us how to train SEALs. You probably couldn't make it through the first day of real training." Sarah felt the familiar anger rising in her chest, but she pushed it down. She'd learned long ago that the best response to bullies was patience. Let them talk. Let them assume. The truth would come out eventually. "I'll try to stay out of your way," she said, turning to leave. But Marshall wasn't done. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You know what? I don't think you understand how things work here. This is a place for warriors, for people who've earned their place through blood and sweat, not for people who got hired because of some diversity quota." The words stung more than Sarah wanted to admit, not because they were true, but because she'd heard variations of them her whole career. Before she could respond, Marshall's hand shot out and shoved her backward. Sarah's injured leg buckled slightly, and she stumbled back toward the mud pit the recruits had been crawling through. She tried to catch her balance, but Marshall shoved her again, harder this time. "Maybe you should take a bath," he sneered. "Wash off that perfume before you come back to a real military base." His companions laughed as Sarah fell backward into the mud. The thick, cold slop splashed up around her, covering her clothes and hair. She lay there for a moment, stunned not by the fall, but by the sheer cruelty of it. Around the training field, people had stopped to stare. Some looked shocked. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Sarah pushed herself up slowly, mud dripping from her arms and face. She looked up at Marshall, who stood above her with a satisfied smirk. He had no idea what he'd just done, no idea who he'd just assaulted, but he was about to find out. Part 2. Sarah stood in the mud, water dripping from her hair and clothes. Every eye on the training field was watching her now. She could see the recruits frozen in place, uncertain what to do. Some looked horrified at what they'd just witnessed. Others were trying hard not to laugh. Marshall stood at the edge of the mud pit with his arms crossed, a triumphant grin on his face. "You should probably head home and clean up," he called out. "Maybe this job isn't for you after all." Sarah took a slow breath. Her first instinct was to respond, to put this man in his place right here and now. But she'd learned discipline through years of operations where the wrong move at the wrong time could get people killed. She needed to handle this the right way. She climbed out of the mud pit, her movements careful because of her leg. The injury ached from the fall, but she kept her face neutral. Without a word to Marshall or anyone else, she walked across the field toward the administrative buildings. Behind her, she could hear Marshall's voice boom out. "All right, show's over. Back to training. This is what happens when people who don't belong try to play soldier." The walk to the headquarters building felt like a mile. Sarah's clothes were caked with mud, leaving a trail behind her. People stared as she passed, some with pity, some with curiosity, and a few with barely concealed amusement. She kept her head up and her eyes forward. When she reached the building that housed the base commander's office, the young sailor at the desk looked up and gasped. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need medical attention?" "I need to see Captain Rodriguez," Sarah said. "Now." The sailor looked uncertain. "The captain is in a meeting. I can schedule you for—" "Now," Sarah repeated, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the young man straighten in his chair. "Yes, ma'am. Let me check." 5 minutes later, Sarah stood in Captain Rodriguez's office, still dripping mud on his carpet. Rodriguez was a career officer in his 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen plenty of action. He looked at her with a mixture of shock and confusion. "Commander Chen, what happened?" He'd been briefed on her arrival, one of the few people who knew her real background. "I was pushed into a mud pit by Chief Petty Officer Derek Marshall," Sarah said. "In front of approximately 30 recruits and several other personnel. He made it clear that he doesn't think I belong here." Rodriguez's face darkened. "He put his hands on you?" "Twice. Shoved me both times." The captain stood up, anger flashing in his eyes. "That's assault. I'll have him arrested immediately." "No," Sarah said. Rodriguez looked at her in surprise. "No? I don't want him arrested. Not yet." Sarah wiped some mud from her face. "Sir, you and I both know why I'm here. My record is classified. No one on this base knows what I've done or who I am. If you step in and protect me now, I'll just be seen as someone who ran crying to the boss. Marshall and his friends will think they were right about me." "They assaulted you, Commander. There are rules. Rules that will make my job here impossible," Sarah interrupted. "Sir, I need to do this my way. Give me 1 week. Let me handle this through proper channels, but on my terms." Rodriguez studied her for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. "You have 3 days. But if Marshall so much as looks at you wrong again, I'm stepping in whether you like it or not. Understood?" "Understood, sir." "And Chen?" Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, I read your file. What happened to you in Syria? You saved 8 lives. You're a hero, whether anyone here knows it or not." Sarah nodded but didn't trust herself to speak. The mission in Syria was still too raw, too painful. She'd saved her team, yes, but she'd also been forced to leave behind a local translator who'd helped them, a man with a family, a man who'd trusted her. The guilt of that still weighed on her every day. She saluted and left the office, heading to the temporary quarters she'd been assigned. The shower washed away the mud but couldn't touch the anger and humiliation that burned inside her. As she stood under the hot water, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't just prove Marshall wrong. She would show this entire base what real strength looked like. That evening, Sarah sat at her desk and began reviewing the training schedules. She had 3 days before her official start date, 3 days to prepare. She studied Marshall's training methods, his schedule, his patterns. She looked at the upcoming classes and found what she was looking for, a demonstration exercise scheduled for Friday morning. Marshall was scheduled to lead a special training session for the new SEAL candidates. It would be attended by senior officers, including Captain Rodriguez. It was meant to showcase the high standards and excellence of the training program. Sarah picked up her phone and made a call to an old friend at Naval Special Warfare Command. After 20 years in the community, she had connections everywhere. It was time to use them. When she hung up, she had everything she needed. Friday morning would be very interesting indeed. Part 3. The next 2 days were strange for Sarah. Word had spread quickly about the incident at the training field. Everywhere she went on base, people whispered and stared, some with sympathy, others with judgment. She heard snippets of conversations as she passed. "Did you hear about that woman Marshall threw in the mud? I heard she went crying to the captain. What did she expect showing up here like she belongs?" Sarah ignored it all. She spent her time studying, preparing, and making quiet arrangements. She also spent time watching Marshall and his crew. They were clearly feeling confident, even bragging about the incident to other instructors. Marshall seemed to think the matter was closed, that he'd successfully driven away an unwanted presence. He had no idea what was coming. On Thursday afternoon, Sarah received a package via special courier. Inside was her dress uniform, freshly pressed, along with something she hadn't worn in months, her trident pin. The small gold insignia of the Navy SEALs seemed to glow in the light. Also in the package were her official orders, unsealed, and a letter from a vice admiral she'd served under in the past. That evening, she laid everything out carefully. The uniform, the medals she'd earned over 20 years, the ribbons that told the story of her service, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with Valor, Navy Cross. Each one represented a moment of sacrifice, a test passed, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. Sarah dressed in her quarters with the same careful attention she'd given to preparing for combat missions. Every button perfect, every crease sharp. She pinned on her medals and finally, reverently, attached her trident. Looking in the mirror, she saw not the woman who'd been shoved in the mud, but the SEAL she'd earned the right to be. The demonstration was scheduled for 0900 hours. Sarah arrived at the training field at 0845. She stood at a distance, watching as Marshall and his team set up for the exercise. Captain Rodriguez was already there, along with several other senior officers. The SEAL candidates stood in formation, young and nervous. Marshall was in his element, barking orders and strutting around like a peacock. He hadn't noticed Sarah yet. She waited, letting him begin his presentation. "Gentlemen," Marshall announced to the candidates, "what you're about to see is the standard you must meet. Being a SEAL isn't just about physical strength. It's about mental toughness. It's about proving you belong here through action, not words or politics or diversity requirements." Sarah felt her jaw tighten at that last comment, but she remained still. Marshall continued, "Some people think they can walk onto this base and call themselves warriors without earning it. Some people think—" "Chief Petty Officer Marshall," Sarah's voice rang out across the field. Everyone turned. Marshall's expression went from confusion to recognition to something like disdain when he saw her approaching. But then she got closer, and people began to notice her uniform, the medals, the trident. Marshall's face went pale. "Commander on deck!" one of the candidates shouted, snapping to attention. The others followed immediately. Even Marshall, after a moment of frozen shock, came to attention. Sarah walked through the formation, her limp barely noticeable now. She'd taken painkillers this morning, knowing she'd need to push through. She stopped directly in front of Marshall. "Chief, I believe you were making a point about who belongs on this base and who doesn't. Please, continue." Marshall's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Around the field, people were staring at Sarah's uniform, doing the math. The medals, the trident, the rank. This wasn't some desk officer. This wasn't a diversity hire. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice formal. Attention all personnel. For those who don't know, this is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen. Commander Chen completed SEAL qualification training 8 years ago. She has served in Special Operations Forces for 2 decades, with deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and several locations that remain classified. Rodriguez paused, letting that sink in. Commander Chen is here as our new senior training advisor, specifically to help improve our preparation of SEAL candidates. She was personally requested for this position by the Naval Special Warfare Command based on her exemplary service record. Sarah watched Marshall's face turn red, then white, then red again. She could see his mind racing, trying to figure out how to salvage this situation. Now, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent field. I understand there's a demonstration planned for this morning. Chief Marshal, would you mind if I participated? Ma'am, I don't think... Marshall started. That wasn't really a question, Chief. Part 4. The training field had gone completely silent. Every eye was locked on Sarah and Marshall. The young SEAL candidates looked confused, uncertain what they were witnessing. The senior officers wore expressions ranging from surprise to grim satisfaction. Captain Rodriguez had a slight smile on his face. Marshall swallowed hard. Ma'am, with respect, the demonstration was planned for the candidates to observe our instructors running the course. It's not really appropriate for... For what, Chief? Sarah's voice was steel wrapped in silk. For a commander to show what she expects from the people she's advising? I think it's very appropriate. She turned to address the candidates directly. Gentlemen, here's something you need to understand about being a SEAL. It's not about being the biggest or the loudest. It's not about humiliating people who you think are weaker than you. It's about competence, discipline, and respect. It's about proving yourself through action, not words. Sarah looked back at Marshall. Chief, you told me earlier this week that I probably couldn't make it through the first day of real training. Well, I'm here now, in uniform. With the trident, I earned through blood and sweat in the same training you went through. So let's settle this. You run the course, I'll run the course. We'll see who finishes first. The color drained from Marshall's face. He was trapped and he knew it. If he refused, he'd look like a coward in front of everyone. If he accepted and lost, his reputation would be destroyed. But he'd already destroyed any chance of a graceful exit the moment he'd shoved Sarah into that mud pit. Ma'am, your injury, Marshall tried. My injury is my concern, not yours, Sarah interrupted. Unless you're afraid, Chief? That did it. Marshall's pride wouldn't let him back down in front of the candidates and his fellow instructors. No, ma'am, I'm not afraid. Good. Then let's make this interesting. Sarah raised her voice so everyone could hear. The standard obstacle course, full combat gear. Whoever finishes second buys the entire base coffee for a week. And whoever loses... She paused, letting the tension build. Issues a formal apology to everyone on this field for their behavior. Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat. Commander Chen, are you sure about this? Your medical profile is cleared for full duty as an advisor and instructor, sir, Sarah said. I'm not asking to go back to field operations. I'm just running an obstacle course. Rodriguez studied her for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Gentlemen, clear the course. Get these two suited up. 20 minutes later, Sarah and Marshall stood at the starting line. Both wore full combat gear, 40 pounds of equipment, including Kevlar vest, helmet, and a rubber rifle. Sarah's leg was throbbing already, but she forced the pain into a small box in her mind. She'd done this before, run missions with worse injuries, kept going when everything in her body screamed to stop. The obstacle course at Coronado was legendary. Walls to climb, ropes to swing across, tunnels to crawl through, and the final killer, A cargo net climb up a 40-foot tower. For someone with a damaged leg, it would be agony. Sarah didn't care. Marshall looked at her one more time before the start. She could see the calculation in his eyes. He was younger, bigger, stronger. He thought he had this won. He didn't know about the pain she'd already survived. The bullet wound in Iraq, the shrapnel in Afghanistan, the night in Syria when she'd carried a wounded teammate 3 miles through enemy territory with a broken rib. This course was nothing compared to that. "On your marks," Captain Rodriguez called out. "Get set! Go!" They exploded off the starting line. Marshall jumped ahead immediately, his longer legs eating up ground. Sarah paced herself, knowing the course was about endurance as much as speed. The first obstacle was a wall climb. Marshall hit it first, scrambling up and over. Sarah was right behind him, her arms burning as she pulled herself up. Her legs screamed in protest when she landed on the other side, but she pushed through. Pain was just information. It told you there was a problem, but it didn't have to stop you. The rope swing came next. Marshall grabbed the rope and swung across the mud pit below with ease. Sarah followed, her upper body strength surprising several of the watching instructors. Years of compensating for her leg injury had made her arms and core incredibly strong. They crashed through the tire run, their boots pounding in rhythm. Marshall was still ahead, but Sarah was gaining. She could hear his breathing getting ragged. He was going too fast, burning energy he'd need later. The tunnel crawl was next, a 50-foot pipe barely wide enough for their gear. Marshall dove in first, but Sarah knew this was where she could make up ground. The crawl was all about technique and mental toughness. Size didn't matter here. She pulled herself through the darkness, ignoring the way the confined space made her heart race, ignoring the memories of being trapped in a collapsed building in Mosul.